Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for this evening's story. So let's get started, shall we? Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a drizzling, soaking wet, miserable day when Anthea Cadogan peered out of the decayed old pancake shop window in this idyllic, prepossessing, North American, quaint seaside town on the Olympic Peninsula, boasting pristine beaches and spectacular scenic vistas that was often regularly frequented by visitors in the late spring, summer and early autumn, when her Uncle Buck had first opened up the Dreamy Maple. In the very beginning, he had nursed some lingering doubts that the pancake business would actually thrive, especially on inauspicious, dull, gloomy days like this, when the oppressive pewter skies were foreboding, and when the unfriendly, capricious weather promised to turn away holiday-makers from the seaside town faster than a flock of truculent geese. Against all the odds that seemed to be stacked against them, things turned out better than they could have expected, much to Buck Cadogan's surprise. The pancake shop, the Dreamy Maple, his ingenious entrepreneurial business idea and enterprise that he and his deceased wife had both started up, had blossomed like the dogwood trees in May, and these blossoms never appeared to fade, no matter what time of the year it actually was. It would seem, when the clouds were stained in a grey abyss, and the weather was fiercely fickle, the Dreamy Maple was an ever-constant, a hive of buzzing activity, as if the pancakes themselves would help people to escape the moody blues and lift their spirits exponentially. The locals in the small town were devoutedly loyal to the Dreamy Maple, and there was definitely a friendly sense of community. The beaches in this part of the world were far more used for exploring and walking than swimming, although that did not stop some local people from throwing themselves into the ice-cold waters of the Pacific. Anthea was running the place for Uncle Buck, while he was unfortunately indisposed, and by all accounts doing a great job for him on his behalf, as her natural organisational skills meant that things ran very smoothly. After all, who did not want to cheer themselves up by enjoying a delicious piping hot latte and piles of steaming pancakes drizzling with a plethora of maple syrup? Better still, for those with a palate not inclined to favour sweet stuff, the Dreamy Maple had a savoury menu on offer, offering all manner of savoury crepes, toasted cheeses and delicious healthy soups. It helped, of course, that the chef, a man called Drew Skinskull, was a masterful chef who produced sumptuous food. Too bad he was an alarming, unapproachable man, much like a snapping turtle, and was more than a little intimidating in every regard. Anthea wisely kept her distance from him. He wore his hair in a spicy buzz cut, and had oversized muscular arms that looked like he worked out very hard in a gym, lifting up disproportionately heavy weights. His tan skin was covered in some rather threatening-looking sailor's tattoos, and he wore several piercings in his ears and nose, along with a truculent, rather severe expression on his face, as fearsome as one of those brawny bouncers that stand outside nightclubs, looking like they'd happily clap anyone that wound them up the wrong way across the head with a baseball bat. Put it this way, if you needed someone to play a gangster for Universal Studios, Drew Skinskull would fit the role admirably. Some people said his bark was worse than his bite, and that there was a sweeter side to Drew Skinskull. But if there was, Anthea didn't want to find out about it. She knew if you saw a lowering, dangerous dog, you kept your wary distance, and she felt that way about people too. She'd certainly met her fair share of disagreeable, unsmiling, pugnacious and thorny clients over the years, who had visited the attorney's office where she worked in downtown Seattle. And in Anthea's wizened opinion, Drew Skinskull was as disagreeable as they come. Anthea Cadogan had agreed to look after Uncle Buck's pancake shop while he recovered and recuperated from pneumonia in hospital, She had always been close to her Uncle Buck, and taking time off from her job in Seattle as an attorney's personal assistant suited her fine. She was enjoying serving the people in this small town, whom had made her feel very welcome. And if the truth be told, returning to her job in downtown Seattle was not something she greatly relished. She'd never have considered herself a small-town girl, but this unassuming seaside town had managed to ambiguously worm its way into her heart. The more time she spent out here on the Pacific Peninsula, the less she wanted to return to Seattle. The Dreamy Maple had at one time been an old Victorian house that had been miraculously converted into a pancake shop. Her uncle lived on the upper floor of the property, which had been turned into a very sumptuous, comfortable home, boasting its own private kitchen and living quarters. One side of the Dreamy Maple, with its green and white striped awning above the window, faced the street. The other side faced the promenade, overlooking a long ribbon of white beach sand and the turquoise blue ocean. Situated next to the Dreamy Maple were other converted Victorians that had also been transformed into all kinds of interesting shops. A boutique selling eclectic-looking garments of fashion, a shop selling seaside curios and trinkets, a baker selling all manner of delicious baked goods, a delicatessens, an ice cream shop, another coffee shop, a greengrocer's and a butcher. When you left the promenade and descended the wooden steps and walked to the end of the beach, you came to a wild area of untamed sculptural rocks and sprawling woodgroves of Douglas firs. You could take your dog for a walk on the beach and then down a rambling footpath through the tall, lofty trees, and some of those walks were very scenic, opening out into exquisite panoramic ocean views. What was there not to like about this part of the world? Anthea knew where she worked in Seattle. There was a weightiness to the environment, as everyone arrived to work buttoned up in their well-fitting suits and designer ties, always minding their P's and Q's, worried that they were not being politically correct at all times, lest they should cause offence, concerned about crossing their T's and dotting their I's, and having kittens about the next ominous deadline rearing up its ugly head and demanding their swift attention, or else. Sometimes in that resolutely tense, overwhelming, insufferable work environment, she felt like a frog in a pressure cooker, with the heat being turned up, that was suddenly threatening to explode. But it never did, although there were a few near misses. Her boss, Mr. Prt1, was the most neurotic and sullen man she'd ever met. He had lost all his hair shortly after taking charge of the officers, possibly just from the stress of such responsibility. To look at, you would never have believed it, for he boasted a full head of layered chestnut brown hair that looked like his own. But Anthea knew differently. She knew he'd had a special procedure done that ensured the hair was fitted to his skull with a special glue, and it looked like the real deal, and was treated as such. Even Mr. Prt1's own wife did not know the hair on his head was not his own. That's how good it was. People were always complimenting him for his amazing hair, but Anthea knew he was as bold as a baby's bottom. When you were a personal attorney's assistant, you knew things about your boss that others did not, and you learnt to keep secrets. Mr. Prt1 owned the word uptight, as if it was his middle name, for he lived on his nerves. He wore Savile Row pinstripe suits to work every day, especially made to measure for him, from a London tailor's. He always looked debonair, professional, self-assured, competent, as if he had everything under his control. But underneath the deceptively cool facade that Mr. Prt1 presented to the world, he was boiling over with an unbridled sense of panic. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" he'd say to Anthea. "This has to be done ASAP. Oh, Anthea, we've got to get this done now. I've got Mr. Haunton breathing down my neck. He's asking me when is the next project going to be completed. If this is not done as soon as possible, I might as well dig my own grave. We have to do it now. Now, Anthea." He always sounded so earnest, as if any moment the world was going to collapse on his head, and he'd stop at anything from not allowing that to happen, and counteracting the threat of an asteroid plummeting to Earth. Don't worry, Mr. Pipin. It's all sorted. I've got it all under control. It's going to be just fine, Anthea would assure him. Mr. Pipin had been through more assistants than you could care to imagine, but most of them could not work for such an overwrought man. Mr. Pipin had appreciated how calm Anthea was in a crisis, how she never flapped, and how soothing her voice was when everything in the office became topsy-turvy. Anthea had been working for Mr. Pipin for 2 years, and even though she'd taken leave to come and work at the Dreamy Maple, the poker-faced Mr. Pipin was begging her to come back already. "I'm sorry, Anthea, to do this to you. I don't mean to disturb you, but I'm up to my ears with chaos and pandemonium. This assistant I've got is driving me nuts. She doesn't understand deadlines. It's like an alien concept to her. I tell her to get something done, and I find her fiddling with WhatsApp on her cell phone, contacting her friends when I need things done now. I don't think I can cope with this woman. She's doing my head in. She doesn't even know how to spell Seattle. She lives here, for God's sake. Who does not know how to spell the name of their own hometown? I rarely think she is, you know," he whispered down the phone. "Not desperately bright." Anthea had calmed down Mr. Pipin, assuring him she'd be back at work in due course. In truth, being out here in this beachside town, she couldn't help re-evaluating her entire life, wondering whether the rat race and the regular dramas in the Seattle office with Mr. Pipin were worth investing her energy in. Anthea, although in her mid-30s, had discovered there were a few grey hairs already sprouting among her blonde ones, and surely that was not normal. If she continued working for Mr. Pipin, she was sure she'd turn completely grey by the time she turned 40, and the idea pleased her not. As Anthea stared wistfully out of the window, at the very grey, bleak views onto the promenade, and watched the raindrops spattering against the windows, their tears beading in long rivulets down the glass pane, she realised that this was not going to be a good day. She could taste the bitter sense of foreboding on her tongue, but where the ambiguous sense of trepidation came from, she wasn't actually certain. Maybe the weather was putting her in a melancholic state of mind. That was it. It wouldn't be long before the doors were merrily ringing with customers. One of the waitresses, Nellie Toscan, arrived at work promptly, shaking her waterproof parka rather vigorously, like a shaggy dog's coat, so that Anthea was sprayed by some of the water. "Sorry about that, Anthea," she said, promptly hanging her coat up on a hook behind the reception desk. "It's bucketing out there," said Nellie. "I can't believe the weather today. It's really bad. I think we'll get lots of customers today, trying to cheer themselves up," said Nellie, her face breaking out into a bright, sunny smile that conflicted with the miserable weather outside. The Dreamy Maple shone like a warm beacon of cheery, flamboyant light in the dreary darkness of a grim, uncongenial April morning, where the inauspicious pregnant clouds had finally relinquished their heavy load onto the earth, and the sound of raindrops pelting against the roof was so loud that many of the windows in the Dreamy Maple began to rattle. Nellie very casually put her green and white striped apron on over her jeans and said, "I don't know about you, Anthea, but I'm going to have a coffee to warm up. Care to join me?" "Sounds like a jolly good idea," said Anthea. Anthea liked the relaxed, carefree attitude of the people who worked here, who took life in their own stride. "It's quite a miserable day out there today," said Nellie ruefully. "The forecast is predicting rain all day long," she groaned. "Still, in my experience, it's not bad for business. People will want to come into the Dreamy Maple just to warm up and to line their stomachs with something hot. We must get Chef Skinskull to make some of his creamy corn chowder. His corn chowder is the best you've ever tasted, and his chicken pies are to die for. Some people order it just as take-out, it's so good." "That is a good idea," said Anthea obsequiously. "Please will you ask him, Nellie, to do that? I refuse to ask him for any favour. The man gives me the creeps. Why on earth would Uncle Buck ever hire a man like him? I admit he's an excellent cook, but couldn't he have found someone who looked a little bit more amenable, perhaps? That man looks like a piranha that just might bite your fingers off. If you dare dip them into the water, if you know what I mean. I prefer to keep my distance from him." Nelly chuckled. "Your Uncle Buck hired him because he's brilliant, Anthea. He's the reason the Dreamy Maple is such a success. You'd do well to remember that. I know he looks intimidating. I mean, when I first met him, I was scared of him too. He's so big and burly, and even when he smiles, he looks like he's scowling. But believe it or not, underneath it all, he's quite a sweetheart when you really get to know him." Anthea raised a cynical brow. "I'll believe that when I see it, Nelly. In my opinion, when a crocodile makes friends with a chicken, in my experience, the chicken ends up getting the raw end of the deal. I know all about people like Drew Skinskull. In the attorney's office in Seattle where I work, I've met some formidable tyrants like him, who are far from approachable." "You're funny," said Nelly, giggling. "You take life far too seriously, Anthea. I only have to take one look at you, and I know by your uptight body language that you're a city girl. Even the way you dress is far too smart for our humble town. I think the sea out here will defrost your anxiety in due course. You mark my words, it'll transform you. Believe me, you'll never want to go back to Seattle." "Somehow I doubt that," said Anthea gingerly. "I'm not sure I'm really cut out for life in a small town. I'm probably used to pumping way too much adrenaline, which is why you say I don't know how to relax." As Anthea had expected, the downcast weather did not abate. It continued to unabashedly pour down with rain. Even when she stood on the wet crepuscular promenade and looked out on the Saturnine beach, there was not a soul in sight. Not even a lone dog trespassed eagerly across the ribbon of beach sand to go exploring. And only a couple of forlorn-looking seagulls perched on the balustrades, looking out to sea. Incredibly miserable they were. Anthea threw out some old bread for them, and they squawked in delight, fighting over the last crumbs between themselves. She observed the morbid-looking ocean, seemed as grey and tempestuous as the sky itself. By all accounts, the cantankerously Plutonian weather did not put off people from coming into the warm, congenial bowels of the Dreamy Maple. On the contrary, a few people waited for tables in their cars to be available. The Dreamy Maple was definitely doing a thriving business. People's waterproof windbreakers hung haphazardly over the backs of chairs, as they sat back enjoying piping hot cups of coffee, lattes, and anything warm that you could drink, along with delicious food. Anthea found herself rushed off her feet, running to different tables, taking down orders, and engaged in cheerful banter with the customers. You could hear the buoyant surf of the ocean waves bouncing furiously against the rocks and rolling steadily forward towards the shoreline, along with the clinking of cutlery and the happy chatter of people's cheerful voices. It would seem that the most popular choices on the menu were steaming corn chowder, chicken pie and chips, hot apple pie, and blueberry pancakes with maple syrup and ice cream. Anthea was to find, even if the weather was cool, people were never adverse to ordering ice cream that melted on their pancakes like butter, and was a sought-after accessory to have with sweet pancakes, no matter how pitifully cold the weather was. It was during the lunchtime service that Nelly told Anthea that her Uncle Buck was discharging himself from hospital prematurely, against the doctor's salient recommendations. "I've just spoken to your Uncle Buck on my cell phone," she told Anthea. "He's most insistent that he's coming home. He says not to worry about him. He'll be getting an Uber taxi back to the Dreamy Maple, and that you don't need to pick him up." "That is so typical of Uncle Buck," said Anthea, grimacing. "I'm really not happy about this. I wish to God he'd listen to the doctor's advice. He can be so mulishly stubborn at times. It doesn't help that it's a miserable day, not the sort of day anyone should choose to discharge themselves from hospital. You've got to admit there is a decided nip in the air, and most people would like to believe it's spring, but you can kid yourself as much as you like. It's way too cold to be spring. Besides, I've never considered April spring." Nelly rolled her eyes. "You know you're doggedly determined, Uncle Buck," she said, laughing. "When he has his mind wilfully set on something, wild horses will never change it for him. It's in his DNA to be disagreeably difficult. He said the doctors are not impressed with him for discharging himself. But he says he'd rather die a miserable death than spend another night in hospital. I think he gave them such a hard time. Eventually they just caved in. I guess I would too if I were in their boots. I can't imagine what it is like having someone as mulishly stubborn and intractable as Uncle Buck as a patient. That bull-headed man is utterly incorrigible, and it's tough going having to treat him, I imagine. Well, I guess that means he must be feeling a whole lot better, said Anthea begrudgingly, if he's giving all the medical staff a hard time. But when he comes back here, I'm sending him straight up to bed, you mark my words. He's still not well enough to be trotting around the place as if he's just only had a slight cold. You mustn't forget that pneumonia very nearly killed him. He'd do well to remember that. Besides, he's also on high blood pressure medication and blood thinners, and with pneumonia as well, he needs to watch his health carefully. Anthea felt frustrated about Uncle Buck's obstinance and refusal to stay in hospital. He was returning home far too soon, against the doctor's recommendations. But what could she do about it? She was run off her feet. The other waitress, Elisa, had phoned in with a sore throat, complaining that she couldn't work. Uncle Buck had warned Anthea that Elisa was one of the most unreliable members of staff, who'd failed to come to work if she had a paper cut or a splinter in her finger. She's a very good waitress, Uncle Buck had told Anthea, but she's a hypochondriac. If she gets a tiny cut, she thinks she's about to bleed to death, and will call in sick, so you cannot rely on her 100%. But Nellie will never let you down. But why don't you get rid of Elisa then? Anthea had asked Uncle Buck. Surely you don't want an unreliable member of staff on your team. But I like Elisa, said Uncle Buck. Why would I want to get rid of her? She's quirky. People around here like her very much. And most of the time she turns up for work. But she does have her moments. I make allowances for her. This is not Seattle, you know, where we spit people out for breakfast if they don't conform to our expectations. Anthea was busily serving another table of customers when she suddenly noticed Nellie standing in the doorway. She was talking to a man who she guessed at once must be the Uber driver. The expression on her face was as grim and incommodious as the weather itself. Nellie was shaking her head in frustration and appeared to be extracting Uncle Buck's overnight duffel bag from the man's hand and then parking it behind the cashier's desk. Where was Uncle Buck, thought Althea, hurriedly trotting over to the Uber driver with an expression of confoundment on her face. The Uber driver, on seeing Anthea's quizzical questioning look, was bashfully apologetic. I'm just dropping off your uncle's bag. I picked him up at the hospital, he said. I dropped him off about 5 minutes ago. He claimed he'd seen something very big on the beach. He wanted to know what it was. It was drizzling badly. He told me he'd been in hospital for pneumonia. I tried to advise him that it was not a good idea to walk on the beach after he's just discharged himself, but he failed to listen to me. He told me to drop his luggage off here, and he'll walk back from the beach himself to the Dreamy Maple. He says that you mustn't worry about him at all. It's not your fault, said Anthea, reassuring the Uber driver kindly. That uncle of mine is the absolute end. Any excuse to take a walk down the beach, and he will grab it with both hands. A couple of days ago, he was struggling to walk down a hospital corridor on his own, and now he wants to go walking down a beach. What the hell was he thinking? He's been hospitalized for pneumonia. The weather outside is grim. It's miserable for a man in his condition. I could kill him for being so negligent. It wasn't an excuse. Well, not really, said the taxi driver, looking rather awkward. What do you mean? Asked Anthea incredulously. The Uber driver looked rather embarrassed. I think your uncle might be a bit delusional after being cooped up in a hospital bed for so long, he said apologetically. Who knows the kind of drugs he was given for his condition? I didn't like leaving him in such a state, but what could I do? He was so insistent. He claimed to have seen a massive Bigfoot on the beach, but I'm not sure he could see anything. The beach was covered with a thick veil of mist. I couldn't see a thing myself, so goodness knows what he could see. He kept saying to me, "Stop the taxi now! Stop the taxi now! My God, I've just seen a Bigfoot on the beach! I've seen a Bigfoot! You've got to drop me off here! You've got to let me off here!" He was very excited. His breathing was raspy. I really wondered if his medication was hallucinogenic or something. 'Cause I could not see anything on the beach myself. It was so blurry. My windscreen window was misting over. Your uncle wanted to go and check it all out, and I could do nothing to stop him. He was so insistent. He told me to tell you he'd be right back, and that he'll see you soon. "I'm sure it wasn't a Bigfoot," laughed Anthea. "Those things don't even exist, do they? They're just legendary. A bit of fiction, that's all they are. If he saw anything, it was likely a piece of driftwood that washed up to shore. It's foggy out there. He must have been seeing things." Anthea thanked the Uber driver and took her uncle's duffel bag up to his bedroom. Then she removed her apron. "You man the fort, Nellie. I'm going to trot down the beach quickly to make sure Uncle Buck is all right and strong enough to walk home alone. Honestly," she said, shaking her head furiously, "isn't he incorrigible? I've never known anyone like him. Why does he never listen to sound reason and good advice? How could he discharge himself from hospital like that? And now he's walking up a beach in miserable conditions like this. What on earth is he thinking? If he's not careful, he'll get a relapse and have to go back to hospital all over again." "Well, you know your uncle," said Nellie. "Nothing ever surprises me about that man." Anthea carried her Uncle Buck's warm fleece-lined waterproof parka in her hand for him to wear. She was worried that after being cooped up in a hospital bed for 3 weeks, whether he'd have the strength and physical endurance to actually walk down the beach on his own. Surely he must be feeling decidedly cold. It would make her uncle's condition much worse, walking down a beach like this, when the weather was so formidable. What would the doctors think if they knew what he was doing right now? Anthea shuddered to think. Even on a bright sunny day, she'd be grievously concerned about her uncle's welfare. But walking on a beach in his feeble, rather fragile condition was madness. What on earth was he thinking? And all this stuff about a Bigfoot. She'd never heard anything so ridiculous in her entire life. The Uber driver at first was reticent and rather reluctant to admit to seeing anything. But he did say that for a fleeting brief second, through the fog, he'd seen something ambiguously big on the beach that was too vague to discern what it was. But he certainly did not believe for a moment that it could have been a Bigfoot. He believed, like Anthea, that it was possibly a hulking piece of driftwood that had been washed up to shore. Anthea thought seeing things through an obscure vaporous mist was rather like seeing shapes in the clouds, which is likely what Uncle Buck had done, and henceforth had got carried away, like a feather on the wind. It was ironic that she'd never known him to show the remotest interest in the subject of Bigfoot before. In fact, they'd never discussed the creature together. Why this sudden fixation? Maybe he had too much time on his hands in his hospital bed to exercise his imagination, and by all accounts the fictitious dreamy world her uncle had inhabited for the last 3 weeks had blurred the distinction between what was real and what was not. One thing was for sure. Her uncle's imagination was not feeble. Too bad his body was. Anthea put on her waterproof windbreaker with its hoodie, along with her sneakers, and trotted over the broad walk onto the steps until she was finally on the beach. There was not a solitary soul around. The beach was completely deserted, as no normal person in their right mind would walk down the beach in precarious conditions like this, with the exception of Uncle Buck, of course. The icy wind whipped against her face as blasts of sand bludgeoned into her eyes. She closed her eyelids tightly to fight off the granular invasion. She could feel sand was sticking to her skin, burning her face unapologetically. The ocean waves were galloping friskily, like white horses thundering to the shoreline at a ferocious speed. Anthea walked steadily along the beach. She stopped dead in her tracks. She could see a trail of footprints in the sand that was so incredibly large she knew no human being on earth could have feet this size. And in that sombre moment of reflection, she was forced to conclude that maybe the ambiguous creature her uncle claimed to have seen on the beach may well have been a Bigfoot, for no one else could have feet this large. With regret, the evidence of these huge feet would be wiped away, for the breakers were galloping rambunctiously towards the footprints, flooding them with water. Anthea stepped up her speed as the wind blasted against her body. She so wished she could be anywhere else in the world right now than on this lonely beach. Then she saw the shadowy figure of her uncle on the rocks, just sitting there nonchalantly, watching the ocean views, as if it was a perfectly beautiful sunny day. Anthea could feel an indignant anger bubbling inside her. It was one thing for her Uncle Buck to insist on walking back home, taking a casual stroll down the beach, and quite another to sit down there on the rocks, being whipped by the wind and stirred up viciously by the cold weather, when you've just come out of hospital with pneumonia. Anthea marched stridently across the beach, fighting off the windy elements with an insatiable indignance. She was going to give Uncle Buck a lecture from hell, one he would never lightly forget. What did he mean by sitting on the rocks on the beach in weather like this? Did he want to be readmitted to hospital with double pneumonia this time? Why was he dicing with death, as if it was all a big joke? She called out to her uncle, "Uncle Buck! Uncle Buck! Uncle Buck!" But her voice was rudely swallowed up and drowned out by the howling wind, and Uncle Buck continued to stare out blankly towards the ocean, blindly ignoring her calls. Either that, or he hadn't heard her at all. Anthea was breathing heavily, her breath fast and furious, her heartbeat flustered, and her cold, blistered skin red and scratchy, as the abrasive sea sand had made her feel very itchy. "Uncle Buck, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she cried out. But Uncle Buck did not turn around to look at her, so she shouted at him again, "Uncle Buck, this is not funny! What are you doing? You shouldn't be sitting here on the beach!" It was profoundly clear to Anthea that her Uncle Buck had not heard a word she'd said. He was still staring out to sea, as if caught up in a languid daze. It was hardly a wonder. He was probably too weak to walk down the beach, and had grown very sleepy and tired. "Uncle Buck! Uncle Buck! Are you all right, Uncle Buck? Are you all right? Are you okay?" But her uncle failed to respond to her urgent calls. Finally she caught up to him, tapping him urgently on the shoulders, but he still did not flinch. That was when she realized that Uncle Buck was freezing cold to the touch, his face as white as a blank piece of paper, his eyes glazed over, and his body was propped up in a sitting position, so he looked as if he was staring out to sea, but the eyes that took in the views of the ocean were completely vacant. In a trice, an ominous prickle of dread trickled down Anthea's spine. She stared at her uncle, aghast, with an open mouth. She reached out for his arm to feel his pulse, but she realized there wasn't one. She threw her arms around her Uncle Buck, who flopped over on his side, and she cried, "You stupid idiot! You stupid idiot! You weren't strong enough to walk on the beach! What were you doing? Now your heart has failed!" Anthea was furious with her uncle, devastated at the same time, and with trembling hands she clumsily pulled the cell phone out of her jacket, calling the emergency services, informing them that her Uncle Buck had died on the beach, and it was a probable heart attack. She found herself slapping her uncle's dead corpse with her hands. "Uncle Buck, how could you do this to me? How could you do this? Why wouldn't you listen? You'd be alive now if you'd listened." A couple of hours later, Anthea sat at a table in the Dreamy Maple, staring blankly into space. She couldn't believe that her Uncle Buck would no longer be around for her, that he was finally gone from her life. The pancake shop was closed. Nellie was giving her sweet hot drinks to soothe away her angst. "I'm so sorry, Anthea. Really I am. None of this is your fault. Your silly uncle. He discharged himself too early. He was too damn bloody-minded. You know what he was like. He wasn't well enough to come out of hospital. Anyone could see that. The conditions were pitiful today, and my guess is that his heart just gave in. But it is my fault, Nellie. Don't you see that?" wailed Anthea. "I should have picked him up from the hospital myself. There's no way I would have ever allowed him to take a random stroll down the beach. But because I was too busy in the shop, I didn't insist on picking him up myself. And why on earth did that cab driver not refuse him his wishes? Anyone could see he was far too frail. Suffice to say, everyone in the seaside town was completely devastated to hear about Uncle Buck's fortuitous passing. Gifts and flowers arrived magnanimously at the pancake shop, by the bucket load, everyone expressing their extreme condolences about Buck's untimely passing. When Sheriff Solly Markham arrived at the Dreamy Maple and asked to speak to Anthea privately, she sensed something was amiss by the serious tone of his demeanour, but she'd never have anticipated what the sheriff was about to divulge in her wildest dreams. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, good night and goodbye.